In 1942, no fighter on Earth could follow a bomber from England to Germany and come home. The Royal Air Force accepted it. The Luftwaffe accepted it. The Air Corps Tactical School had built a doctrine on it and staked the lives of its crews on the arithmetic. One answer went the other way. It stopped asking fighters to fly further and started asking bombers to shoot better. What came out of it was a stubby twin-gun blister bolted under a bomber's chin, aimed by the one man aboard who had never been given a gun. It carried a name: Bendix. By then, Vincent Bendix had been bankrupt for 3 years and out of the company that carried his name for one. 8,680 aircraft would carry it. Not one of the aircraft it was built for survives. The turret worked. The aircraft it came from was dead in 8 weeks. The problem was not a mystery, it was a measurement. Through the winter of 1942, staff officers at 8th Bomber Command worked over a map of Europe with a pair of dividers. They set the point on an airfield in East Anglia, opened the arms to the combat radius of the best escort fighter then available, and drew a circle. The arc closed over the Low Countries and the coast of France. Every target that justified the campaign lay outside it. That gap was not treated as a failure of planning. It was treated as settled physics, and an entire school of thought had been built to make it survivable. At the Air Corps Tactical School through the 1930s, officers had worked out a theory of high-altitude daylight precision bombing that required no escort at all. Bombers would fly higher than interceptors could comfortably reach. Bombers would fly in formations that covered one another. Bombers would defend themselves with massed machine gun fire from 100 barrels at once. The pattern they eventually flew, the combat box, was a 3-dimensional stack of aircraft arranged so that every approach angle crossed somebody's field of fire. Claire Chennault, an instructor in pursuit tactics at the same school, argued that the exercises used to prove this had been arranged to give the bomber men the answer they wanted. He was overruled. The doctrine went to war intact, and the careers of a generation of officers went with it. The aircraft built around that doctrine had been given a name in 1935 that stated the theory out loud: Flying Fortress, a fortress that has to carry its own walls. The arc on the map stopped short of every target that mattered. The demand that followed was written in the language of a supply problem. On April 1, 1942, the proposal for an escort built out of a bomber was put before a conference in the office of the Director of Military Requirements in Washington. It was approved 8 days later. On May 10th, the contract went to Vega, the Lockheed subsidiary already building fortresses under license, and that August the Army Air Forces handed over the second production, B-17F, serial number 41-24341, to be taken apart and rebuilt as something else. The reasoning behind it was not foolish. If range could not be given to a fighter, then guns could be given to something that already had the range, and the formation could carry its own protection all the way to the target and back. On paper, the logic closed neatly. At the Eglin Proving Grounds in the autumn of 1942, the logic met a scale and a stopwatch. The converted aircraft topped out at 296 miles per hour. Its service ceiling came in at 29,400 feet, more than 1.5 miles below the altitude a standard fortress could reach. Those two numbers were a verdict on the whole concept, and the men reading them understood exactly what they meant. An escort that cannot climb to the formation cannot protect the formation. An escort slower than the aircraft it guards will be left behind at the moment it is needed most. Somewhere in a Florida office, an engineer read a ceiling figure 1.5 miles beneath the altitude his aircraft was supposed to join, and the arithmetic did not require interpretation. There was a sound engineering case for refusing the whole idea, and it was not cowardice. A gunship adds weight and drag without adding a single horsepower. It can never outrun the thing it is protecting because it is the same airframe carrying more. Consolidated ran a parallel experiment on the Liberator, produced one heavily armed prototype, and abandoned the concept outright. The engineers who walked away were not being timid. They were being correct. The number on the report was 296. This was supposed to be the escort. The name that ended up on the one surviving piece of that program belonged to a man who no longer owned anything. Vincent Bendix had built his company out of an engine starter and a set of brake patents bought from a French engineer, incorporated in South Bend in 1924, and turned it toward aviation in 1929. By the early 1930s, he sat on top of one of the largest engineering combines in America. He also spent money the way a man spends it when he believes the graph only goes one direction. General Motors began quietly accumulating his stock in 1937. In June 1939, he was forced into personal bankruptcy with roughly $14 million of debt, and the sale of everything he personally owned raised about $1 million. He stayed on as chairman of a company he no longer controlled. In the spring of 1942, 4 months into the war, he resigned. General Motors installed Ernest R. Breech in his place. That was the position when the turret entered service. The name stamped into the data plate was his. The hand that drew it was not. He had no part in its design, no stake in the company producing it, and no seat in the room where the decision was made. There was a second reason the industry should have laughed at the idea. Bendix had already tried aiming a gun that the gunner could not sit inside, and it had failed in public. Remote-sighted belly turrets were fitted to the early Liberator and to the Mitchell, aimed by a man lying on the fuselage floor, squinting into a periscope while the aircraft maneuvered around him. The equivalent installation on the first 112 Fortresses of the E model is attributed in most published accounts to Bendix and in the aircraft's own technical order to Sperry, and the argument has never fully closed. What is not disputed is the outcome. The turrets were removed. From the Liberator, they came out entirely. From most Mitchells, they came out as well. The Fortress installation was replaced at the 113th airframe by a manned ball turret with a gunner physically inside it. The reason was human, not mechanical. Gunners looking through a periscope that pointed one way while their bodies faced another became disoriented and nauseated. Crews stopped believing in the equipment. Some covered the site with plywood. Some pulled the guns out to save weight and left painted broomsticks in the ports so that the aircraft still looked armed from a distance. The industry had already tried aiming a gun the man could not sit in. It had not worked once. What Vega built at the Army's direction was not an aircraft with a few extra guns. It was a bomber that had stopped being a bomber. The bombs went. The bombardier's sight went. The margin went with both of them. In their place came a second powered turret on the spine, where the radio operator's single mount had been, twin machine guns at each waist window instead of one, armor plate at the crew stations, and a bomb bay converted into an ammunition magazine. A standard Fortress went to Germany with roughly 3,900 rounds. This aircraft carried about 11,275. The finished machine grossed some 4,000 pounds heavier than a fully armed and fully loaded Fortress. Every one of those figures was a promise made to a crew. 4,000 pounds of guns, plate, and belted ammunition was the physical form of a guarantee that a bomber formation could survive the 200 miles beyond the fighter arc without help. Men flew into Germany on the strength of it. The price was stated in the same breath, and everyone senior enough to read a performance chart could see it. An aircraft that cannot shed weight cannot hold formation with aircraft that can. A Fortress arrived over the target heavy and left it light because it had just dropped several tons onto the target. The gunship arrived heavy and left heavy. At the exact moment the formation accelerated for home, the escort became the slowest thing in the sky, and it became the slowest thing in the sky over hostile territory, at reduced altitude, with the fighters still up. That was the bargain. Protection bought by the pound, paid for out of reach. Inside that failing aircraft, one component solved a problem nobody had expected it to solve. Underneath the extreme nose, in the place a bombardier would normally lie over his sight, Vega fitted a small powered turret carrying 2 half-inch machine guns. It was remotely operated, which was the technology that had already failed everywhere else. What made it different was geometry. The gunner was the bombardier, and he was not looking through a periscope pointed somewhere else. He sat behind the glazed nose and looked directly at the thing coming toward him, with a sight in front of his face and a control yoke that swung down out of the fuselage side when he needed it and folded back up out of the way when he did not. The guns pointed where he was already looking. A German fighter making a frontal pass closed at something over 600 miles an hour combined, which gave both men roughly 3 seconds. The periscope had failed because it separated the man from the target. The chin mounting worked because it did not. The consequence for the crew was specific. The bombardier had been the least defended man in a fortress, riding in a plexiglass nose with a handheld gun on a swivel and cheek windows that could not fire straight ahead. He now had the only powered weapon in the aircraft that could answer the attack the Germans had begun to prefer. The man with no gun became the man the formation depended on at 12 o'clock. On November 10, 1942, the converted aircraft flew for the first time. It was carrying more guns than any aircraft in the American inventory, and a bomb bay full of ammunition it would never be able to spend fast enough to matter. The case against it already existed. It had been measured at a proving ground in Florida 9 months before the first of them crossed the channel, and filed. Subscribe, and leave a like if this kind of research is worth continuing. The contradiction is still ahead. 12 of the service test aircraft reached the 92nd Bomb Group's 327th Bombardment Squadron at RAF Alconbury on 8 May 1943. On 29 May, they went to war for the first time, sent out with a heavy force against the submarine pens and lock gates at Saint-Nazaire. 8 were allocated, 7 flew. Everything the trials had predicted happened on schedule. The formation bombed, turned for England several tons lighter, and began pulling away from its own escort. The gunships fell back. Ammunition feeds jammed in the new twin waist mountings, and the aircraft came home needing modification to the feed chutes before they could fly again. In England, ground crews began fitting cheek guns back into the noses that the original drawings had deleted. The comparison was not close. A converted gunship that could not exceed 296 miles per hour was chasing bombers that had just thrown away their payload. A ceiling of 29,400 feet sat well beneath the altitude a fortress group habitually operated at. Roughly 11,275 rounds of ammunition were being carried by an aircraft that could not reach the fight. One thing happened that day that went into the record for a different reason. A single gunship was attacked. The chin turret opened fire, and the German pilot broke off the pass. That is the entire documented combat evidence for the component that outlived the program. One attack, one aircraft, one turn away. The mission report went into the file at Alconbury alongside the list of jammed guns and the recommendation for feed modifications. It read like a failure with a footnote. One fighter had turned away. That was the entire evidence base. It was enough. The Germans had found the frontal approach 6 months earlier, and they had found it by studying wreckage. Eglin Meyer took command of 3 Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II in November 1942. On November 23rd, over Saint-Nazaire, he led Focke-Wulfs against a force of 36 unescorted fortresses and 8 liberators, and claimed 2 of the former and 1 of the latter. Working with Georg Peter Eder, he built the result into a method, a kette of 3 fighters, a chain in line coming in from ahead and slightly to the left, firing a short deflection burst and passing through. Adolf Galland, as inspector of fighters, endorsed it and pushed it out across the force. The tactic was an argument about arithmetic. Attacking from astern meant flying up the crossfire of an entire combat box for many seconds. Attacking from the front meant 3 seconds of exposure against a nose that carried handheld guns on swivels and cheek windows that could not bear straight ahead. Luftwaffe assessment held that 4 or 5 cannon strikes into a bomber from head-on would destroy it. Through 1943, the cost of that arithmetic became public. On the double strike against Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August, 60 bombers did not come back. On the return to Schweinfurt in October, 60 more. Deep penetration into Germany was suspended. On July 7, 1943, with the trial still running, the commanding officer of the 92nd Bomb Group, Colonel William M. Reed, submitted a report listing the gunship's mechanical problems and recommending that no more of them be sent to the European theater. Set that document beside the Eglin trials of the previous autumn, and the shape of the thing becomes clear. The performance case against the aircraft had been measured, written down, and filed 9 months before the first one crossed the channel. The figures had not changed. Nothing was learned in England that was not already known in Florida. Reed signed a report condemning equipment he had been given to prove. He was right about the aircraft, and the Army was right to have tried it because in the summer of 1943 there was nothing else on offer. The last of them flew at the end of July. 14 raids in total. The aircraft was finished in 8 weeks. The turret was already being cut into nose sections on a production line in California. The turn came in 4 stages, and they did not arrive in the order anyone planned. The first stage was industrial. Douglas fitted the Chin, mounting to the last 86 airframes of its final Fortress F model production block. From the summer of 1943, the G model went into production at all 3 plants with the turret as standard, along with staggered waist positions and a redesigned tailgun station, all 3 of them lessons taken directly off the dead gunship. Production of the G model eventually reached 8,680 aircraft at a peak rate of 16 a day. A component that had proved itself once on one mission against one fighter was now being built faster than crews could be trained to use it. The second stage was tactical. The frontal attack did not stop, it stopped paying. No order was ever issued in the Luftwaffe forbidding pilots to attack a fortress head-on, and the claim that they refused to do so is a legend built on an arithmetic change. What is documented is what the arithmetic produced. Through 1944, the assault groups were reorganized around a different geometry entirely, and the aircraft they were given was a Focke-Wulf A-8 modified into something closer to a flying gun platform than a fighter. Roughly 900 were built by Fieseler at Kassel. They carried 30mm cannon, armored glass, and additional plate around the cockpit. They were called the Sturmbock, the battering ram. They attacked from dead astern in company front, pressing to within 100 yards before firing. They were so heavily loaded that they could no longer defend themselves against Allied fighters and had to be escorted by Messerschmitts. The men flying them had accepted the same trade the Americans had tried and abandoned. Wait for protection. Protection paid for out of maneuver. The third stage was intelligence, and it arrived in the least dignified way possible. In December 1944, 5 German pilots were shot down near Aachen and interrogated. They described the new attack in detail. 3 waves of 8 to 16 aircraft forming into company front, with fighters stacked above as cover. They named which gun positions they feared most and which signs told them a bomber was no longer defending itself. The Americans learned the working state of their own defensive scheme from prisoners. The fourth stage was range, and it ended the argument the other 3 had been having. In the spring of 1944, the escort that everyone had agreed could not be built appeared over Germany. It was a single-seat fighter carrying drop tanks, and it reached Berlin in March. It did not carry a second dorsal turret. It did not carry armor plate at 4 crew stations. It did not carry 11,000 rounds of ammunition through the flak belt. It carried fuel where all of that would have been, and it went further than any gunship could have gone. After the war, Hermann Goering was asked by Karl Spaatz when he had known the Luftwaffe was losing control of the air. He answered that once American long-range fighters could escort as far as Hanover, it was not long before they were over Berlin. The bomber never became its own escort. It simply survived long enough for a real one to arrive. Vincent Bendix did not live to see any of it. General Motors had been the dominant shareholder in his company since 1928 and would remain one until 1948. Breach ran the business from Detroit. The corporation Bendix had founded became, through the war years, one of the largest suppliers of aviation electronics and components in the United States. Its name pressed into instruments, magnetos, brakes, and turrets across the American inventory. The data plate said Bendix. Tens of thousands of them said Bendix. Not one of them belonged to him. He did what men like him do when the thing they built keeps running without them. In 1943, he started again, founding a small helicopter company in Stratford, Connecticut, and set his engineers to work on a coaxial machine intended for a family to own after the war. The first prototype flew in 1945. The premise was a piece that had not arrived yet, and a market that never did. On the 27th of March, 1945, he died at his home in New York of coronary thrombosis. He was 63. Germany surrendered 6 weeks later. There is a particular kind of quiet in the record here. A man who had once owned 15 factories and been decorated by 2 European governments spent his last years in a rented shed in Connecticut, drawing rotor blades, while the largest air campaign in history flew with his surname stamped under the nose of nearly 9,000 bombers. He had not designed the turret. He had not approved it. He had not been in the building. The engineering was neutral. The ownership of it was not. The name was on the war. The man was not. The aircraft that carried the idea into combat were disposed of with no ceremony at all. Those that survived the trials came home to the United States through the autumn of 1943 and were stripped of their armament, repainted with training numbers, and put to work teaching gunners. One had already been flown to RAF Kimbolton and parked as a display piece before being shipped back. In May 1945, they went to reclamation, most of them to the field at Ontario, California, where they were broken up and smelted. None survives. Not one airframe was sold onto the civil market, and no museum holds one. The following year, a film crew shot a sequence in that same graveyard for the best years of our lives, and 2 of them are visible in the background, sitting among thousands of other aircraft waiting for the furnace. That is the only moving footage most people have ever seen of them, and almost nobody watching the film knows what they are looking at. The component went on into the largest bomber production run of the war, and stayed there until the last fortress rolled out. The company outlived the man, the aircraft, and the war, and then it destroyed itself in a manner that had nothing to do with engineering. In 1982, the Bendix Corporation launched a hostile bid for Martin Marietta. Martin Marietta sold assets and launched a counterbid for Bendix. United Technologies joined in. Within 31 days, the attacker had become the target, and in 1983, the Bendix Corporation was acquired by Allied Corporation. The announcement described a combination of 2 companies with complementary strengths. What happened was that a 60-year-old independent corporation ceased to exist as an independent corporation. Its president lost his job, and roughly 4,000 employees lost theirs. Allied became Allied Signal. Allied Signal merged with Honeywell in 1999. The logo survived all of it. The blue banana went on being printed on packaging long after the company that owned it had been folded into a chemical concern and then into somebody else's aerospace division. Corporations do not die the way aircraft do. They are absorbed, and the name is kept because the name still sells. What was built is a short list, and it is worth stating flatly. 1 prototype, 20 service test aircraft, 4 trainers, 14 combat missions, a chin turret, staggered waist positions, a redesigned tailgun station, and 8,680 bombers carrying the first of those into the last 2 years of the war. What was taken is the same length: a fortune in 1939, a company chairmanship in 1942, a life on the 27th of March, 1945. Every airframe in the program smelted at Ontario in 1945. The corporate name as an independent firm in 1983. 4,000 jobs with it. They were right that the frontal arc was the killing angle, and right that it could be closed. They were wrong that a bomber could ever escort a bomber. The evidence is still touchable. In the collection of the National Air and Space Museum, there is a Bendix a 16B chin turret, a training unit, cataloged and disarmed, an object rather than a weapon. In Avon, Ohio, the same name is on air brake systems for commercial trucks under German ownership since 2002. On general aviation instrument panels, the name sits inside Honeywell's product line. And every surviving fortress in the world, at Duxford, at Chino, at Dayton, wears that turret under its nose because every surviving fortress is a G. Nothing else from the aircraft it was designed for exists anywhere on Earth. The war was ultimately won in the air by a machine that carried no walls at all. Whether Reed was right to kill the program is still argued by people who study that campaign, and the argument belongs in the comments. Subscribe if this is the kind of history worth more of, and leave a like if the research earned it.